What if I told you that the 2008 financial crisis, the worst economic collapse in a century, actually made certain people richer? Not slightly richer, generationally richer. While millions of ordinary families lost their homes, their jobs, and their savings, a small group of investors, bankers, and insiders walked away with some of the greatest wealth transfers in modern history. And the system didn't punish them. The system rewarded them. So the real question isn't how the rich get rich. The real question is, why do they never seem to lose, even when everything crashes? The answer will change the way you see money forever. Here's something nobody tells you in school. When you and a billionaire both invest, you are not playing the same game. You think you are. The language sounds the same: stocks, real estate, returns. But the rules are completely different. When the average person takes out a loan to buy a house, they are the debtor. They owe interest every single month. That interest doesn't build their wealth, it drains it. For 30 years. But when a wealthy investor borrows money, they use it to buy assets that produce income, real estate that pays rent, companies that pay dividends. The debt works for them. The interest is a business expense, often tax deductible. The asset appreciates. They get richer while being in debt. Same instrument. Completely opposite outcomes. This is the first secret. Debt, in the hands of the rich, is a wealth accelerator. In the hands of everyone else, it is a wealth extractor. The mortgage on your home is paying your bank. The mortgage on a rental property is being paid by your tenants. The credit card funding your vacation charges you 22% interest. The credit line funding a business acquisition might generate 40% returns. The rich didn't just discover money. They discovered the direction money moves, and they positioned themselves to receive it, not release it. Let's go back to 2008. Lehman Brothers collapses. The housing market implodes. Trillions in value evaporate overnight. Panic, chaos. The nightly news is full of ordinary Americans lining up outside foreclosed homes. Now here's what happened behind the scenes. The U.S. government and the Federal Reserve launched one of the largest financial rescue operations in history, not for homeowners, but for banks. The Troubled Asset Relief Program pumped hundreds of billions into the very institutions that created the crisis. Interest rates were slashed to near zero. The Fed began buying toxic assets off bank balance sheets. For the average family, the recession lasted years. Unemployment surged past 10%. People lost homes they'd spent decades building equity in. For major banks and asset managers, their stocks eventually recovered, then soared. Those who had cash during the crash bought assets at catastrophic lows. A Manhattan apartment, a foreclosed property, an undervalued company, all available at a fraction of their worth to anyone who had liquidity. And who had liquidity in a crisis? The same people who always do. Those who weren't dependent on a single paycheck, who owned assets rather than owed on them, who had access to cheap institutional credit even when consumer credit dried up. Crisis, it turns out, is not a great equalizer. It is a great sorter, and it always sorts the same way. There is a mechanism at the heart of modern finance that almost nobody talks about openly, even though it explains almost everything. It is called the Cantillon Effect. Richard Cantillon was an 18th century banker and economist who noticed something simple but devastating. When new money enters an economy, it doesn't arrive everywhere at once, evenly distributed like rain. It enters at specific points, usually through banks and financial institutions, and moves outward from there. The people closest to the source of new money benefit the most because they receive it before prices rise. By the time that money ripples out to ordinary workers and consumers, inflation has already begun to erode its value. This is not ancient history. This is 2020. When the Federal Reserve injected trillions of dollars into the economy in response to the pandemic, where did it go first? Into financial markets. Asset prices exploded. The S&P 500 recovered in months. Real estate markets went vertical. Bitcoin went from $5,000 to $60,000. Meanwhile, working-class families received stimulus checks worth a few $1,000s, and then watched grocery prices, rent, and fuel costs climb for the next 3 years. The rich got an asset boom. Everyone else got inflation. Same money creation event, completely different experiences, because of where you sit in relation to the flow of capital. Let's talk about assets, because this is where the divergence becomes almost mathematical. The top 10% of Americans own roughly 93% of all stocks. The bottom 50% own almost none. So when the stock market rises, and over the long run, it always rises, who benefits? When real estate appreciates, who holds the largest portfolios? When a company performs well, who owns the equity? This is why inflation, which sounds like a universal problem, actually functions differently for different people. If you own a house, Inflation raises the value of your asset while eroding the real cost of your fixed mortgage. If you rent, inflation simply raises your rent with no compensating asset gain. If you own stocks, inflation often corresponds with rising corporate revenues and share prices. If you live paycheck to paycheck, inflation is a straight tax on your survival. The wealthy do not just have more of the same things you have. They hold fundamentally different categories of assets, ones that grow during inflation, generate income during recessions, and appreciate even during instability. You accumulate savings. They accumulate ownership. And ownership, historically, has beaten savings in every decade, in every country, under almost every economic condition. There is one more layer to this, and it is the most uncomfortable one. The rules of the financial system were not designed in a neutral room by objective economists. They were shaped, decade, by the people who had the most to gain from shaping them. The carried interest loophole allows hedge fund managers to pay a lower tax rate on their earnings than a nurse or a teacher. It has survived every attempt to close it because the people it benefits fund political campaigns. Capital gains taxes in most countries are lower than income taxes, meaning wealth growing from assets is taxed less than wealth earned from work. This is not an accident. It is a policy choice, and it was made by people who held assets. Bankruptcy laws, which allow corporations to discharge debts and restructure, rarely work the same way for individuals. A student loan follows you through bankruptcy, while a corporation can restructure hundreds of millions in debt and emerge leaner and more profitable. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply what happens when the people who design the rules are the same people who benefit from them. Now, and this is important, none of this means the system is impenetrable. What it means is that you have to understand the game before you can play it differently. The first shift is mental. Stop thinking of yourself as a consumer and start thinking of yourself as an owner. Every decision you make is either moving you toward ownership or away from it. The second shift is structural. Minimize the debt that extracts and, when possible, use debt that produces. A mortgage on a home you live in is manageable. A credit card balance you carry is a slow drain. A loan that funds an asset generating income above the interest rate, that is leverage, not slavery. The third shift is positional. Understand where you sit in the flow of capital. You may not be a bank, but you can hold equity in companies that benefit from inflation. You can own real estate. You can invest early, consistently, and in assets, not just savings accounts slowly losing value to inflation. The rich don't have a secret formula. What they have is a different relationship with money, one built over generations, reinforced by law and policy, and protected by systems most people never stop to question. But awareness is the beginning of strategy. And strategy, applied consistently, compounds. The uncomfortable truth is this: the financial system was not built to make you wealthy. It was built to make the flow of capital predictable, and predictability, in finance, means it mostly flows in the same direction, upward. But history is not without its exceptions. The people who built wealth from nothing understood, at some level, that they had to escape the role they were assigned, debtor, consumer, renter, and step, however imperfectly, into the role of owner and investor. That step is available. It is not easy. It is not fast. But it begins with seeing the system clearly, not as a neutral playing field, but as a designed environment, one you can navigate intentionally once you understand the rules. The rich don't avoid losing by luck. They avoid it by design. Now you know the design. If this changed the way you see money, subscribe. Because the most powerful financial education isn't in any classroom, it's in understanding how the world actually works.